Assalamualaikum dan salam sejahtera. Pilihan Raya 2020 ini mesti diadakan secepat mungkin untuk mendapatkan mandat baru sebelum wabak COVID-19 menjadi lebih buruk, kata PAP. Pilihan Raya Singapura tidak adil dan tidak bebas. Itu pandangan ahli Parlimen ASEAN untuk hak asasi manusia. Namun walaupun tanpa rapat umum dan penjarakan sosial, semua kawasan undi akan ditandingkan. Tidak ada kemenangan percuma atau walkover. Pilihan Raya Singapura 2020 ini memang agak luar biasa dan pasti membawa kesan dan implikasi yang perlu difikirkan. Untuk membincangkan isu ini, kita telah mengundang dari Malaysia Dr Abdillah Noh, pensyarah Universiti Islam Antarabangsa Malaysia. Dari Sydney, Australia, Dr Lily Zubaidah Rahim, Fellow University Georgetown dan juga penulis buku The Singapore Dilemma. Dan tidak lupa Encik Abdul Rahman Said, salah seorang pengasas Suara Melayu Singapura. Kalau kita boleh mulakan dengan meminta ahli panel kita memberi sedikit pandangan tentang kempen 9 hari, termasuk hari ini, yang telah berlangsung dalam Pilihan Raya Singapura 2020 ini. Kita mulakan dengan orang yang paling jauh, Dr. Lily, silakan.
Selamat petang. With regard to the question, excuse me for speaking in English. With regard to the election, I was a little surprised when the government announced that elections would be held in the middle of a pandemic, which is, somewhat unusual. So I mean and I think that was the view of many Singaporeans and other observers. And it was, I think, the view of many that this does not bode well for the opposition, because if we look at the 2001 election just after September 11, it's an international crisis, you could say. The PAP did very well in that election in an environment of fear and anxiety. So, and then, I heard, reading reports from Singapore, and so talking to people that, this is not good for political discussions pertaining to the current economic crisis, the pandemic, and so on, and in this environment of fear. However, I think in the last 3 to 4 days, the momentum has shifted, and it appears as though that the opposition might be having some momentum going their way. But then again, you could say that that's why elections in Singapore traditionally have been relatively brief. In this case, slightly more than a week. So hypothetically, if we had a 3-week or 2.5-week election, one could argue that the momentum might be even more strongly in favor of the opposition. But it's hard to tell at this stage, particularly since we don't have many polls publicly available to political observers, the public, and so on, as to gauging the public sentiment. So your guess is as good as mine, I think, at this stage.
Thank you, Dr. Lily. We'll come back to you with the details later. Let's go to Malaysia. Dr. Abdillah.
Assalamualaikum. A very good afternoon.
Salam.
Thank you for inviting me. Uh, this particular election is something that that intrigued a lot of people. One is the timing of the election. You would expect that the Singapore government would wait until the COVID-19 pandemic subside to some extent, and then after that, perhaps hold the election, because the election will, they can hold the election up until what, April next year. So the timing of the election is something that is that surprised you, especially with the sort of public health scare that you might have. The other thing that I think that needs to be highlighted here is that I like the quality of leaders that comes through both the PAP side as well as the opposition. And I think that it has been going on for many years now, since 2011, 2015, that the PAP has got no monopoly of quality leaders, anymore. And you will see that trend coming in the next coming years as more and more people, look at the political discussion and get more, involved in it. So the
Dr.
quality
Abdillah,
of,
if I
yes,
can raise a question at this point,
yes.
there are 17 Malay opposition candidates this time around. That's quite a record number. How do you read this?
Well, basically because of the GRC, right? But I also see quality Malay leaders from both sides. One outstanding one, of course, you have Encik Faizal Manaf, and I think that he's credible. And the Workers' Party, Faiza Han, I think she is a very credible opposition. But on the PAP side, I think Mariam Jaafar is very promising. And I think that if the PAP gets into power, she should be given more important roles in government. And I don't see, I should see her, being at the Ministry of Trade and Industry, perhaps, minister in the Ministry of Finance, perhaps. So there are quality of leaders, Malay leaders. But at the end of the day, what is healthy for Singapore? This is good for Singapore because you don't have a monopoly. The PAP hasn't got a monopoly of quality leaders, and this will change over the years, and you see more leaders coming in, and you have a menu, a diversity of leaders from both sides of the political divide.
Okay, let's go to Cik Abdul Rahman first. Dr. Abdillah, we'll go back to you for the more details later. Cik Abdul Rahman?
Okay. I think the timing of this year's general elections is a $100 billion question. Why do it now? The PAP's mandate expires only in April next year. It gives us about 9 clear months before elections need to be held. And we are holding these elections in the midst of a pandemic. Local infection rates are still fairly high. The PAP has argued that they needed to conduct these elections soon, now, on 2 grounds. Number one, they need to be able to implement interventions to address the issues brought about by an economic slowdown as a result of the pandemic. But we can see that the budget allocations amounting to almost $100 billion has already been approved by Parliament within this current mandate. And this will give the impetus for the PAP to implement all the programs that it has earmarked. For example, to create 100,000 jobs and training slots, to set up the National Jobs Council. All of these can be implemented within the current mandate. So the only outstanding reasonable reason that we can see is that the timing of these elections is opportunistic, because part of the budget allocations is to provide relief and payouts to almost everybody. I'm a retiree and I get $600. a person who has lost his job, who has his pay cut, can get up to $9,000. This creates a feel-good effect among the electorate. And I think the PAP wants to capitalize on this to gain its vote share. We saw the same thing happen in 2015. Following the 50th anniversary, there were also payouts, you know, to the pioneer generation and to everybody else. So to me, the timing is purely opportunistic.
I might add that the last election was also unusual, 2015 election, where the PAP received nearly 70% of the vote. And as we all know, this was the election held just after the passing of Lee Kuan Yew, and also Singapore was celebrating the anniversary, the nation's anniversary. And many people have argued that this is an election whereby it's a one-off election, an unusual one, and cannot be readily replicated. So after that election, we've got another extraordinary election in the midst of a pandemic. So two in a row, two unusual elections, which in itself is very instructive. It tells a lot about the PAP.
But sorry to interject. It goes all the way to 2011. If you look at 2011, after the global financial crisis, there is a flight to safety. So, you know, voters basically voted overwhelmingly towards the PAP. And then you have 2015, like what Dr. Lily pointed out, right? And then you have this particular election. So there's always this the idea of timing it in time of a crisis, and then basically there is a flight to safety, and voters will just basically look at the incumbent party and basically vote the way that, you know, that was intended to be.
But in 2011, if you remember, there was quite a big swing for the opposition. They won a unit. You know, 3 ministers were knocked off from that ward.
In terms of the popular vote, and if you look at the popular vote, they got over 60% of the popular, even though they lost. But in terms of the popular vote share, they get, you know, higher. So if you look at the trend, if you look at the voting trend from 1980s onward, there's always this. Whenever there is a crisis, there is a flight to safety, and you see the PAP getting, you know, over 60% of the voting share. So it happens in 2011, it happens in 2015, and in this particular election, it might happen, right? But, you know, I'm just looking at the timing and how people just, you know, get panicky over a crisis and then basically move towards somewhere, you know, that they feel secure.
Dr. Lily, apart from timing, what are the key issues you think in this election?
Well, but the pandemic is obviously a key issue. And there is much debate about the government's management of the pandemic. It is generally agreed that initially the government did do quite an impressive job with handling the pandemic. And then there was a major outbreak with regard to the dormitories and migrant workers. And now Singapore's record is still, I think, the worst in the region. And there are, you know, many others asserting that the government did mismanage or has mismanaged the pandemic by not factoring or taking into account this situation of migrant workers, you know, living in dormitories where up to 17 workers huddled or live in a room. And that is the kind of ingredient, the classic ingredient for the transmission, an explosive transmission of for the pandemic. And NGOs, in fact, did inform the government that they needed to look into this matter early on. So there appears to have been failures on the part of the government. But then again, they come back and say, in hindsight, it's 50-50, but at that time, we didn't have the full picture.
What about the argument raised by Workers' Party that the PAP already has a mandate, but let's not give them a blank check?
Well, this links back to the point that we have made earlier, all of us, about elections in this crisis environment, this pandemic. So it's not just a national crisis, a regional crisis, but an international crisis. And as we've already noted, in crisis environments, governments, not just the Singapore government, but governments around the world, or incumbents tend to do reasonably well. So, but the point is that in any democracy, in any electoral democracy, it is very important to have a vibrant opposition as a check and balance, to promote accountability, to promote transparency, particularly in view of the fact that in the case of Singapore, we've got a real problem with regard to the widening income gap. The income inequality issue is a real one. And in addition,
sorry.
Let me interject at this point, if I may. It's fascinating the narratives being bandied about the elections this year. We see a focus on the pandemic, the interventions, the economic recovery, which are all very, very relevant, very, very timely. But if we recall or look back a year ago before the pandemic broke, the PAP has been touting these elections as giving or getting a mandate for the fourth generation leadership. Moving forward again this year, we see that the performance of these 4G leaders in the management of the pandemic has been, shall we say, less than stellar. So we hardly hear the PAP touting the mantra of getting a mandate for the 4G leadership anymore during these elections. So the focus has been overwhelmingly on the pandemic and the recovery, that what we need to do to recover from this pandemic.
Dr. Abdillah?
Well, I concur. I totally agree that there is a need for diversity of opinion, and I think that this is a great opportunity. I mean, the ASEAN report about free and fair election, but I think that this is an opportunity for Singapore to showcase its democratic process. Singapore has come a long way economically, politically, but this is one way to tell the world how Singapore is able to make that transition to a mature democratic process. But unfortunately, with the timing and all that, they have not been able to do so. And the PAP should not basically look at this pandemic as an opportunity, but basically look at it in terms of how do I create or demonstrate to the rest of the world, especially post-colonial societies that are still grappling with the idea of a maturing democracy, that this is the Singapore way, and therefore I'm going to win, but I'm not going to change the rules of the game. So
do you agree to that?
Sorry, are you referring to me? Are you pointing?
Yes. I'm asking whether you agree to what Dr. Abdillah said.
Well, with regard to, coming back to the issue of the 4G, a mandate for the 4G PAP leadership. In fact, I find this 4G terminology very curious. Second G, third G. It's very similar to the kind of terminology that the Communist Party of China uses. First generation, second generation, third generation. Why are we using that kind of terminology? Fourth. Anyway, that's an issue that could be debated perhaps at another time. But with regard to the 4G grouping, it is the view of many, I believe, that this group were expected, Singaporeans are expected to give them, solid support, so that Lee Hsien Loong, when he is no more Prime Minister, is able to give the baton to this group, and they're expected to govern with legitimacy. However, the responses of the 4G leadership, take for example the pandemic, is far from exemplary. And if we look at their performance during this election, this short period of time, it's also far from, exemplary. And it seems to me that this 4G leadership is very typical of a technocratic type of PAP leadership. And many of them are former civil servants, very good bureaucrats, most of them, exemplary academic credentials and so on. However, one could argue that a politician needs more than that, technocratic skills. And many of them tend to exhibit, they don't seem to exhibit strong political skills and acumen. Their ability to communicate ideas across to the populace hasn't been exemplary.
Dr. Abdillah, can you raise the issue of quality of candidates? Would you agree with Dr. Lily?
This pandemic with this online rallying, really is a double-edged sword, because it can reveal a lot about the potential of the candidates. And you can see that the candidates, the PAP candidates and the Workers' Party candidates, and then you start to realize, the sort of political acumen that these candidates has, and the sort of the ability to articulate ideas. I was watching the debate between Bevin Balakrishnan and Dr. Javis Lim, and it really shows that this particular election, you can actually see the quality of the opposition parties articulating their thoughts. And my take of it is that there is a lot of sincerity in the way they articulate their thoughts. There's a lot of they work the grounds very well, but the PAP candidate seems to be very much scripted, partly because maybe maybe they have an issue with talking beyond the sort of things that they need to talk about. But yeah, you see this happening. So instead of having rallies and you don't see the candidates, some of the candidates talking, this particular election, you can actually see them online, and you can actually able to compare the quality of these candidates.
Rahman, your view?
Yes, I quite agree. The debate surfaced many things. I think the PAP originally designed it to establish their thought leadership on issues, maybe even to the extent of browbeating their opponents. But as it turned out, we see people like Dr. Javis Lim establishing his own thought leadership on the issue. Attempts at browbeating Dr. Lee Soon Juan apparently backfired. In fact, if you look at the SDP manifesto of 4 yes and 1 no, in that debate, the SDP succeeded in achieving their 1 no by making the government deny that there was a goal to increase the population to 10 million. So yes, it is a double-edged sword, and it seems to be working quite well, as much for the PAP as well as for the opposition. The other issue that I want to bring up is the tenor of the campaigning. The PAP has traditionally taken a rational, logical, left-brain approach to campaigning, appealing to the reason of the people. But we see on the opposition side, parties like the Progress Singapore Party preaching a more compassionate government, a more right brain, left brain approach to governance rather than the predominantly left-brain approach of the PAP.
Dalam pilihan raya kali ini, kelihatannya tidak ada isu-isu Melayu yang agak penting yang diperjuangkan atau dibincangkan. But that brings into question, how do we raise issues of race and privilege without being accused of being racist? Berdasarkan apa yang berlaku pada calon Parti Pekerja beberapa hari lalu. Dr. Lily?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really, really important issue. Raising politically sensitive, in the context of Singapore, politically sensitive issues pertaining to race, pertaining to religion, pertaining to discrimination, all forms of discrimination and so on. And I think the case of the Workers' Party candidate and her social media comments and how it's become overblown in my view is an example of this. That in the past, in previous elections, opposition politicians in particular that have raised politically sensitive issues to do with ethnicity and race have been accused of just this, of raking the coals, of potentially undermining racial and religious harmony and so on. But then again, you could say that these are real issues. With regard to the Workers' Party candidate, I think her social issue comments are quite valid. Perhaps she could have articulated it in a different manner. But if we place it in the context of this young woman who is an NGO, has an NGO background based on promoting harmony, based on promoting social justice, I mean, that's her whole track record. We should understand her social media comments based on her track record as an activist, as an NGO person. In other words, the intention of this woman in raising these issues, one could argue, were raised in good faith, and therefore, should not be perceived pitched in a sinister light. It's unfortunate.
Abdillah, can I have Dr.
Okay.
Abdillah's view?
Why can't we argue it in terms of individual rights and human rights? Why can't we take away the ethnicity and says that now this is a person and this is about individual right? Just like, for example, if you put on a hijab, for example, or you put on your Sikh turban, or you put on a cross, right? And if you're asked to remove that, that is really against your individuality, your individual rights. So if we look at it from the individual rights perspective, then the person has the right to explain or to explain herself in a way that she thinks that it will further the idea of individual freedom. So I think that one way to navigate this idea of ethnicity is at the higher end of it. This is really about the individuals, whether you are Muslims or non-Muslims, it doesn't matter, you're an individual. And maybe by articulating it in such a way, we can actually say that this is not about religion. This is not about anything, but it's really about the person and the individual right. And if you argue along those lines, then it's very difficult, to dismiss the argument. So I think that we should move away from this. I mean, this is really, for me, it's not about ethnicity, and of course, it's all political thing that is happening right now because of the heat of the moment. But I think that one of the ways to navigate this is to really look at it from the individual rights perspective.
Okay, Rahman?
Well, you mentioned that no real Malay issue was raised this time. And yet, I think we are still at the level on the basis of asking some very basic questions about Malay members of parliament. What really is the role of a member of parliament? be they from the PAP or from the opposition. I think Dr. Tan Cheng Bock in one of his webcasts did say like the Malay MP is conflicted between his role as a Malay and his role as an MP, which I think may not be valid because first, the Malay MP, if he succeeds going into parliament, goes in as a minority candidate in a GRC. And being a GRC, being a minority member in a GRC would compel him to represent minority issues. This is something that I see quite missing among the PAP candidates. They seem to not talk at all about Malay issues. In fact, there was a chat program involving all the three Malay PAP candidates. And the best they could talk about the Malay community is the so-called Masyarakat Cemerlang, a community of excellence. And the narrative totally ignores the bulk of the Malay community in the lower income groups who are grappling with bread and butter issues on an everyday basis. At another level, and I may be mistaken here, when Halimah Yacob vacated her seat in UT Marsiling to run for the presidential elections, there was no by-election to fill the gap that she left behind. And there was some debate as to whether the minority candidate is there only to go into parliament, but not necessarily staying there forever. So we still are at square one, having to define and needing to define what really is the role of a Malay or minority member of parliament in the House.
Can I hazard a particular issue here? Is there, because of the changing demographics in Singapore, especially when it concerns the Malay population, is there or should there be a redefinition of Malayness? Especially people in their 20s, in their teens, the idea of Malayness, is it defined in the same way as people in their 40s and the 50s, partly because of the sort of policies that they have experienced throughout their educational life? And maybe that's the reason why some of these candidates are grappling with what is the Malay issue, because the idea of the definition of Malayness might be something that they cannot grapple, or something that is something that they have to think hard about. I don't know. I'm just hazarding a guess here, but
Dr. Lily, your views, Dr. Lily?
Well, I did write a book.
Yeah,
20 years ago, deliberately entitled The Singapore Dilemma. And the reason why the book was focused on the institutional, structural, economic challenges, political challenges confronting the Malay community and other economically disadvantaged communities in Singapore. It was called the Singapore Dilemma because of the argument at the heart of the book that this is not just a Malay problem. This is a national problem, and it is incumbent upon the national government to systematically address the socio-economic, educational challenges confronting the Malay community and any other disadvantaged community in Singapore. So, and this is my position till this day. Now, with regard to discussing difficult, challenging, politically sensitive issues in Singapore, I think we need to place it in a broader political context. We need to look at the institutions and the structures operating in Singapore, which tends to hinder any coherent, systematic discussion of such issues. Lest, if you raise them, you're likely to be, many people have been accused of raking the coals, being a racialist, a communalist, and so on. We have this POFMA law, for example, which has been dished out to various people during the election and even before the election. And that tends to hinder or contain or restrict discussion of these difficult issues. We also have other laws in Singapore, in addition to POFNA, so we need to place this within the context of a state. What sort of state are we operating in? In many of my articles and book chapters and books and so on, I have described Singapore as a political scientist, as an electoral authoritarian state. And this is the way electoral authoritarian states operate. It is more, it was mentioned earlier on, let's see these issues as individual rights issues. But Singapore is not a liberal democracy where rights, individual rights, are at the center of such societies. Singapore is not a liberal democracy. And this makes it particularly problematic.
Unfortunately, Malayness is more than an abstraction in Singapore. It is something quite real. For somebody to take part as a minority candidate in a GRC team, he needs to get a certificate endorsed by a committee to say that he is Malay. I mean, there was a time in the 70s when our constitution would actually define what a Malay is. Somebody from the Malay archipelago, whether it's Javanese, Malay, Bugis. Yeah. Today, that clause somehow no longer, to the best of my knowledge, no longer exists in the constitution and found its way somewhere in Mendaki. But it remains that if you are going to contest as a Malay or as an Indian candidate in the GRC, you need to get a certificate from a committee who, given their own criteria, would define you as a Malay or you are not a Malay. And this has created problems. During the reserve presidential elections, we found ourselves with a president, a wonderful lady whom I know very well, a very professional lady, but who has a Malay mother and an Indian father, which would classify her as an Indian. But she is now our president, a Malay president. Okay, that somehow she's certified as a Malay president. Even though ethnically and probably what it says on her identity card, she'd probably be an Indian. So Malayness is something that we grapple with in a very realistic way, not just an abstraction for people to debate about.
Could I say a few words about that? I think you're quite right in highlighting this issue of who is a Malay. In Singapore, in Malaysia, in the Malay world, the Nusantara. In the case of Singapore, traditionally it's been whether you are from the Malay world, your ancestors. But then again, many Malays are kind of intermarried, are mixed, part this and part that, a bit of Arab, perhaps a bit of Indian, and so on and so forth. However, I think you're quite right to note, Rahman, that who is a Malay, the issue of Malay identity has been rather ambivalent in Singapore. And this ambivalence, I guess, is double-edged. But however, the contradictions make this ambivalence difficult, problematic, because of the elected or selected presidency. And the person who is the president of Singapore at the moment. Now, it seems to me that all of a sudden, with regard to the elected presidency, that she was, the government claimed that we needed a Malay president. after decades of not having a Malay president. But was the issue about blocking Mr. Tan Cheng Bock to, in terms of running for the presidency, or was it about being sensitive to the Malay community?
Okay,
And then
let's move away from that because that's rather long and complicated. You could have refocused our attention on the elections this year. Dr. Abdillah, why do you think there are no burning Malay issues discussed during this campaigning?
One, precisely of what happened with Raisa Han. There is a lot of self-censorship on the part of candidates. They don't want to tread into very dangerous water, especially when it comes to the opposition parties. An issue about race and ethnicity was set at alarm bell ringing, and there will be there will be a lot of ruckus when it comes to about ethnic issues, which will cost the opposition party. And I think maybe in their own way they are trying to say, let's not look into that issue because that will cost us some seats, right, among the voters. Which the Raisa Han's issue clearly is a demonstration of it. The other one that I think why Malay issues are not raised is because over time, I come to Singapore once in a while, but I see that the definition of a Malay is very different among the younger Malay population. They speak with a certain way, they think in a certain way, and they might not identify with the sort of issues that Malays in their 40s and 50s look at. And it's partly because of what Dr. Lily says about institutionalization, and so the sort of issues that they grapple is something that they cannot understand what is the real hardcore issue. But that the Malay community does have its own issue, but somehow one is, I don't want to tread there. Second is, what is it that I want to talk about?
I don't quite agree with you. Let's listen to what Rahman has to say.
Well, the PP always tries to define the elections on its own terms, and absent from the debate this time and anything about the Malay community. What we have today is a big black hole in trying to understand the problems facing the Malay community. Now, 20 years ago, during the Go Chok Tong era, the government published two reports, almost 10 years apart, called The Progress of the Malay Community, in which they presented statistics on and trends on the Malay community, performance of the Malay community across different development indicators: employment structure, income, housing. From there we get a composite picture of how the community is faring. For the last 20 years, we've not had any update to that report. So every time we look at the Malay community, we'll be staring at the black hole. Now, I'm sure the PAP knows the state of the community, and the fact that no discussion of the Malay community has arisen during this election, during the campaigning, is quite telling by itself. The opposition naturally cannot raise anything without hard empirical data to back up its arguments. The PAP would have access to this information, but has chosen not to share it with the rest of us. So it opens up, first it explains why there are no real Malay issues raised. Number two, is also telling why there are no Malay issues raised by the PAP this time.
Dr. Lily, you've done in-depth research on some of the issues and dilemmas faced by Malays in your book. Are those issues still here?
Yes. These issues are still relevant. My book was written about 2 decades ago. Now, with regard to concrete data, on the socio-economic standing of the Malay community, educational standing relative to the other communities in Singapore, we can look at the census, that's taken every year, every 10 years or so. And the figures I've seen from the 2010 census suggests that the gap, the socio-economic income educational gap between the Malay community and other communities by and large remains wide. And in some instances, quite alarmingly, the gap has widened even further. Now, this is perhaps why the issue has not been publicly debated. So what is to be done to widen this gap? Because we can't afford for this gap to continue to exist and in some cases widen. This is the recipe for, not robust. You want to create a robust nation, a cohesive nation. You can't have some communities lagging behind. Now, one way of going about, I think, addressing these issues is to establish institutions, structures, such as, for example, if the ethnic minorities assert and claim that there is discrimination, rampant discrimination in the workforce, why not then establish an equal employment opportunity office? After all, the PAP government claims that Singapore is a meritocratic, multiracial society. Let's have such an office that investigates discrimination, or an anti-discrimination board, or an ombudsman's office. And, if we look around the world, particularly in places like Australia and so on, there are these bodies that have been set up to address such issues. And so, let's, instead of just criticizing and so on, I have consistently argued that this is what we need to do. We need to tackle these issues that not just impact the Malay community, but also impact Indians as well, and could possibly also impact new immigrants, could also impact Chinese, educated Chinese, and others within the community. So in other words, a national approach to address these issues.
I absolutely agree. I absolutely agree with you, Dr. Lily. In fact, apart from the Anti-Discrimination Act or Ombudsman, we probably need also a Freedom of Information Act. There's a lot of information that are denied to us, information that will help us to analyze in our own way, in an independent way, how the community or communities are evolving and progressing. But perhaps the strongest strategic point that we need to take is really the thesis of your Singapore Dilemma book. And that is to approach the Malay problems, not as community problems, but as national problems. We are looking today at interventions by community groups like Mendaki and AMP with approaches and techniques that have not changed in decades. I think to be able to view the problem again with a fresh lens is to bring in expertise, perspectives from outside the community. And only then can the problems be seen as national problems. The other aspect is, if the performance of the Malay community is slow, for example, we only have 5% of cohort Malay Malays being able to make it to the university level. Just think what would happen if that figure were to be improved. Our national average would also improve. That means whatever happens to the Malay community will also impact the national average, and that's a good way to start looking at Malay problems as national problems.
Dr. Abdillah, why do you think there's no anti-discrimination law in Singapore?
Precisely what the other panelists are saying. Every time you raise a question about anti-discrimination or discrimination, and if you're on the other side of the political divide, then you'll be shut down. you'll be saying you'll be labeled as a racist, or so and the discussion stops there. The discussion can only surface if the ruling party would want it to be. So at the end of the day, it's about you raising, for example, if, for example, the Workers' Party or the SDP were to raise about this anti-discrimination law, they will be shot down fast, and there's no discussion after that. So the legitimation of certain articulation of ideas reside to a particular political party, for example, but that it will do Singapore a big disfavor, because Singapore it will not benefit Singapore. It might benefit the political party, but it will not benefit Singapore. So it's time that the political parties look beyond, their partisan concern and look at what it means to Singapore. And I think this is a time as good as any for politicians to look at what is good for Singapore. A political diversity is good. A political debate is good. And an honest discussion about discrimination is good, right? But I don't think that at this point we are able to look beyond this. I think we should be, the political party should be magnanimous in terms of its attitude towards certain issues. So yeah, that's one of my concerns here.
We're coming to almost to the end of the show. We need to discuss how this extraordinary COVID general elections and online campaigning, how would this affect the outcome or the results of this general election? With
Yes, sorry, would you like to finish what you were saying?
Said, obviously with no political rallies, you can't meet people in a big crowd. Most of the campaigning are done online and social media. How will this affect the outcome of the elections?
Well, yeah, I think I stated earlier, it's really hard to tell. I mean, this is from my perspective, and I've been analyzing general elections in Singapore for many, many years. And, it's always, the outcomes can be quite surprising. 2011 was surprising, the outcome of the 2011 elections. 2015 was surprising. Now, it's hard to tell this time round with COVID, pandemic, the recession, and so on, and also the atmosphere of fear. There is a fear environment that one needs to factor in. One minister, for example, has highlighted the fact that, the Singaporean government, the PAP, might even lose government if you vote carelessly. A freak election. However, reading, reading articles and going through social media and so on, it seems to me there's a critical mass of Singaporeans who are determined that to make Parliament more diverse. They expect, obviously, the PAP to win, but they want more voices. A plural Parliament, a Parliament that articulates the aspirations of all Singaporeans from various, classes, ethnic groups, and different political persuasions. Now, as with the 2015 and 2011 elections, I think we'll get a clearer picture in the next day or so as to where the momentum is going. As I noted earlier, I think there is some momentum, there's some sympathy with the opposition.
How real is this fear factor about COVID, about the recession, and about votes not being secret? How real is this?
Well, see, it's fear. Fear is very real in Singapore. Fear is very real in any authoritarian society. But fear added with smear, throwing mud at, for example, the woman from Workers' Party, and throwing mud at others as well. So fear, smear, and then there's an element of throwing money at the Singaporean voter, which has occurred in the lead up to the election. So, so this is a very complex mixture of a whole range of things: money, fear, smear, anger, and you know what? I get the sense that there's a lot of anger. In addition to the fear, there's a lot of anger on the ground. The perception that some PAP leaders have become arrogant, elitist, and are not listening to the people on the ground. And
Dr. Abdillah, your views?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. No, there are like one group of hardcore PAP supporters that will, die vote for PAP. Then there's also another core, hardcore, opposition supporters. But there's also the huge middle ground, and the middle ground now, they are saying what Dr. Lily says. They want the PAP to win, but they want more voices. But what I fear here is that there is what in public policy we call the NIMBY problem, NIMBY, not in my own backyard. So what happens is that, or this will happen in Aljunied, it's not going to happen in my constituency, and therefore I will not vote for the opposition. So if everybody thinks like that, that it could be a clean slate. I mean, a clear win for the PAP, because they want the PAP, but they want alternative voices, but it's not in my own backyard. I don't want it to be my own backyard. I want it to be somebody else's backyard. But if everybody thinks like that, then, it will be a very different outcome altogether.
Abdul Rahman?
Yeah, online campaigning, bringing the elections into cyberspace has solidified or has hardened the positions of many who want to see greater diversity in parliament. In other words, from the pro-opposition camp. We've not seen as strong a push by the PAP on cyberspace. They have their own networks, they have their own webcasts, but they don't engage as much as the opposition do on social media. On the ground, it's still very murky. As Dr. Lily said, polls are not allowed during campaigning period, so we can't have a sense of what the ground is feeling like. She said there's some anger, there's a lot of anger on the ground. Mr. Lee Hsien Yang, who had joined PSP, has echoed that same feeling. I'm more concerned, not concerned. I think the fundamentals of the ground have not changed very much. We've seen in the past elections how we have huge crowds attending opposition rallies, and then the outcome, the votes have turned out to be very different. At every election, I also hear from the lower income group, people saying that they've heard that if they do not vote for the PAP, they are not going to get the financial assistance that they are getting now, which is kind of a threat. I'm sure this has not come from the politicians or the parties themselves, more from the party supporters. I think this is something that the opposition should really look into, especially in the future elections, to dispel the feeling like this on the ground, because the lower income groups represent, if you look at the pyramid, the lower income groups form the bulk of the electorate.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rahman. I'm afraid that's all the time we have for this discussion. Thank you again, especially to our special guests from Australia, Dr. Lily and Dr. Abdillah Noh from Malaysia, and of course our own Abdul Rahman. Thank you so much for making time.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.